What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. So, we have got Leviticus 25 for right now. Again, we're getting toward the end of Leviticus. This is one of those books that generally gets overlooked when people are, trying to read through the Bible or, looking for stuff to study from the Bible, because it's a bunch of laws, and that bores most people. But they're all related. All the different laws and talks of, festivals and things like that, it's all related to, God setting the standard for his people of purity and cleanliness in their lives, and B, how they're going to, with the festivals and stuff especially, how they're going to go about, celebrating God, acknowledging him, and the things that he's done for them already and will continue to do, such as harvest festivals and things like that. But anyway, all this to kind of, set the tone for things for God's people before they head out to the promised land. But anyway, that kind of sets the scene for what we're getting into here, generally speaking. So, let's dive right in. Leviticus 25. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, the Lord said to him, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you have entered the land I am giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest before the Lord every 7th year. For 6 years you may plant your fields and prune your vineyards and harvest your crops. But during the 7th year the land must have a Sabbath year of complete rest. It is the Lord's Sabbath. Do not plant your fields or prune your vineyards during that year. And don't store away the crops that grow on their own, or gather the grapes from your unpruned vines. The land must have a year of complete rest. But you may eat whatever the land produces on its own during the Sabbath. This applies to you, your male and female servants, your hired workers, and the temporary residents who live with you. Your livestock and the wild animals in your land will also be allowed to eat what the land produces." Okay, so we've had mentions of Sabbath rest for the people, basically every week. They work for 6 days, and on the 7th day they rest. But this is every 7 years, and it relates more so to the land, and leaving that alone every 7 years. And I'm guessing the idea is a bit similar to what was stated earlier on with regards to, growing trees or plants or whatever, that they need to be left alone for a bit to sort of refresh, restore themselves in a way. This, I think, might have been sort of I don't know if you'd call it a substitute, but this, modern day farmers might do crop rotation and things like that from year to year, where they'll, plant a different kind of crop in a certain patch of the land one year, and then a different kind of crop on that same patch the next year, to not use up all of a certain kind of nutrients from the soil. And I think this might be assisting with a similar notion. You give the plants, essentially, you just sort of let them be every 7th year, so you're not specifically focused on, trying to plant more, trying to get, as much as you can out of the field, or whatever they happened to do that would possibly put more strain on them and on the soil. So, anyway. So basically they weren't supposed to, work the land with any extra planting or gathering or things like that. They could eat whatever the land made on its own, but not, intentionally putting their own stuff in it to add to that. Okay. I guess that does it for that little section. Moving on. Verse 8. In addition, you must count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 sets of 7 years, adding up to 49 years in all. Then on the Day of Atonement, in the 50th year, blow the ram's horn loud and long throughout the land. Set this year apart as holy, a time to proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live there. It will be a jubilee year for you, when each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors and return to your own clan. This 50th year will be a jubilee for you. During that year, you must not plant your fields or store away any of the crops that grow on their own, and don't gather the grapes from your unpruned vines. It will be a jubilee year for you, and you must keep it holy, but you may eat whatever the land produces on its own. In the year of jubilee, each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors. Which begs the question, why would they not be in the land of their ancestors? I guess, depending on various, circumstances and life situations, they could possibly either move to a different land because of marriage, or what a lot of people turn to when it comes to this is kind of servitude situations where basically anyone who would have been, a slave of a certain person, especially because of debts to pay or things like that, they could then be freed. I think it's going to explain more of that as we move along here, so maybe I shouldn't say too much right now. But so basically so it says every 7 Sabbath years. I'm guessing those might be related to the land Sabbaths. So then they would wait 7 of those, and then the next year, the 50th year, is kind of an additional year that they would not do any extra working of the land and things like that as well. Must not plant fields or store away any of the crops that grow on their own. So they weren't even supposed to gather up from the land and try and save those crops long term. It seems like that was more of just a okay, you take what the land gives you each day, almost reflecting a situation like they had with the manna in Exodus, sort of relying on God to provide what was necessary to get by each day. As for the, returning to ancestral land and things like that, I think I'll wait to say too much more on that until, reading further through this section. So, Then we move on to verse 14. When you make an agreement with your neighbor to buy or sell property, you must not take advantage of each other. When you buy land from your neighbor, the price you pay must be based on the number of years since the last Jubilee. The seller must set the price by taking into account the number of years remaining until the next year of Jubilee. The more years until the next Jubilee, the higher the price. The fewer years, the lower the price. After all, the person selling the land is actually selling you a certain number of harvests. Show your fear of God by not taking advantage of each other. I am the Lord your God. So, this was also part of then what got returned in the Jubilee years. Like, if a person sold off land, because they needed money, or if they bought land to try to, get some extra crops and make some extra money of their own. That way, long term, those exchanges would essentially be undone and the land would be returned to the original owner in the Jubilee year. And the value of the land essentially was supposed to be, taking that into consideration, because it's like, well, you're getting the land for this length of time. And obviously more time equals greater value because you can get more out of it. Anyway, verse 18. If you want to live securely in the land, follow my decrees and obey my regulations. Then the land will yield large crops, and you will eat your fill and live securely in it. But you might ask, what will we eat during the 7th year, since we are not allowed to plant or harvest crops that year? Be assured that I will send my blessing for you in the 6th year, so the land will produce a crop large enough for 3 years. When you plant your fields in the 8th year, you will still be eating from the large crop of the 6th year. In fact, you will still be eating from that large crop when the new crop is harvested in the 9th year. So, again, sort of reflecting the situation that they had with the manna in Egypt, or in Exodus as they were leaving Egypt. On the 6th day, God gave them enough manna to last them through the Sabbath day so that they wouldn't do any extra work trying to gather any more food. Similarly, God is giving them a bumper crop in, the 6th year before the Sabbath so that they have enough to get through the Sabbath year. And it says for 3 years, so I think that would also then take into account, if there was an additional year of, not planting because of the Jubilee. Because, so you'd have, year 6, you get 3 years worth of crops. Okay, so that lasts you for, the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year. And I'm not sure if it was also supposed to last, who knows, the amount of extra might have even been increased further when a Jubilee year was approaching, because then you got to figure there's the time to plant the new set of crops before actually harvesting them. So, yeah, anyway. Point is, there would be enough to get them through. All right. So, then we get to verse 23. The land must never be sold on a permanent basis, for the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and tenant farmers working for me. With every purchase of land, you must grant the seller the right to buy it back. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell some family land, then a close relative should buy it back for him. If there is no close relative to buy the land, but the person who sold it gets enough money to buy it back, he then has the right to redeem it from the one who bought it. The price of the land will be discounted according to the number of years until the next year of Jubilee. In this way, the original owner can then return to the land. But if the original owner cannot afford to buy back the land, it will remain with the new owner until the next year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, the land must be returned to the original owners so they can return to their family land. So, that also then explains why they would possibly, be living in a different land, even if it's just a different plot of land, so to speak. If they have to sell off their family's land because they become poor or whatever, then the year of Jubilee rolls around, and no matter what, they get it back. And even, in the meantime, if they, earn some money enough to buy it back before the Jubilee, then they have the right to do so. Like, it was basically, if they had any sort of contract of any sort, it would pretty much have to include something that allowed for that. So, yeah, because, if it's the family land, that's essentially the person's home. So, God didn't want anybody being permanently displaced from their home, essentially. So, then we move on to verse 29. Anyone who sells a house inside a walled town has the right to buy it back for a full year after its sale. During that year, the seller retains the right to buy it back. But if it is not bought back within a year, the sale of the house within the walled town cannot be reversed. It will become the permanent property of the buyer. It will not be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. But a house in a village, a settlement without fortified walls, will be treated like property in the countryside. Such a house may be bought back at any time, and it must be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. The Levites always have the right to buy back a house they have sold within the towns allotted to them. And any property that is sold by the Levites, all houses within the Levitical towns, must be returned in the year of Jubilee. After all, the houses in the towns reserved for the Levites are the only property they own in all Israel. The open pasture land around the Levitical towns may never be sold. It is their permanent possession. So, the Levites, by the way, were the priests, essentially. Aaron was descended from the tribe of Levi, and so essentially, with all the priests being related to Aaron, that's why they had sort of that special exception, even if they happened to be inside of a walled town. But also, their pasture land, where they would have had their own, flocks and herds and whatnot, that was never supposed to be sold. Probably in part because, they needed that for their own, purifying offerings and whatnot. Because had they especially, even more so than anybody else, needed to be, pure because of their work in the tabernacle. Or at the very least, their proximity to the offerings. But I didn't realize the whole walled town thing was sort of an exception to the Jubilee idea. I guess in part because, property inside of a walled town like that wouldn't have so much been like, farmland, where there would be a lot of, growing and harvesting crops and or, animals to raise and all sorts of different things like that. Because such land like that would be, growing crops and, better suited for raising animals, like, that was how a lot of people kind of maintained their livelihoods. So, of course, having that kind of land being returned in the Jubilee, that was essentially giving that person within that certain family, a fresh start to possibly be able to use their ancestral land to make their own living. But inside of a walled town, you wouldn't really have that happening so much, which is why the, buying and selling would have been more permanent. Anyway. And now we get into the part that a good number of people like to make reference to when talking about the Jubilee year. But I'm not going to say too much more before we actually read this. So, verse 35. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and cannot support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or a temporary resident and allow him to live with you. Do not charge interest or make a profit at his expense. Instead, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. Remember, do not charge interest on money you lend him or make a profit on food you sell him. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So, this wasn't even really so much like slavery as we would think of it. This would be more of like, okay, bringing a person into your house. Yes, they would work for you in all likelihood. But it was, you were letting them live with you and, kind of helping to provide for them until they, basically wound up getting their land back. At which point they would return to that, try to make their own living for themselves again. But again, it was as it says in here, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. So you treat them kind of like a member of the family. That's not what we think of when we think of slavery. But in any case, person gets in debt, can't support themselves. All right. Take them in, help them at least be able to survive through that time period until the Jubilee. don't make a profit off of them, don't like try and gain more money from them. They're already poor and can't support themselves. So just like let them live and work and do what they're doing. Previous times when I've talked about slavery and things like that, I was, this is kind of the closest thing that the Israelites would have had to slavery amongst themselves. So that's why it's not always... It can get a bit odd sometimes when you're trying to talk about slavery related to Old Testament passages. Because it was a bit of a different situation than, when we think of slavery, it's like, okay, you work the person extra hard and, they just have to do whatever you say. They're like less than family or even friends. They're more so property. Anyway, enough carrying on about that. Let's continue reading. Verse 39. If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. Treat him instead as a hired worker or as a temporary resident who lives with you, and he will serve you only until the year of Jubilee. At that time, he and his children will no longer be obligated to you, and they will return to their clans and go back to the land originally allotted to their ancestors. The people of Israel are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, so they must never be sold as slaves. Show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. However, you may purchase male and female slaves from among the nations around you. You may also purchase the children of temporary residents who live among you, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as a permanent inheritance. You may treat them as slaves, but you must never treat your fellow Israelites this way. So, again, the Israelites amongst themselves were to be treated more like family if they really, got into that bad of a financial situation, as opposed to people from the lands around them, because they were not, directly part of God's chosen people. Temporary residents, I have to assume, there would have been a way of them knowing who was a temporary resident, because otherwise, wouldn't that fall under someone who's trying to, join the Israelites and therefore should not be treated so much as an outsider? But again, I'm sure there's a way of accounting for that. Only people who were outsiders and, children of temporary residents, maybe even the temporary residents themselves, could have been treated as slaves. Although the temporary residents probably would have had a particular time in mind when they would have left. Therefore, wouldn't have stayed there very long anyway. Anywho, enough digging into the details on that. So, technically slavery was a thing among God's people back then, but it wasn't within themselves. And I'm not saying that makes it right, per se. But really, broader scope, the Israelites were all kind of a big family in a way. Because, all descended from Jacob's 12 sons, which were the namesakes of the 12 tribes of Israel. So, yeah. And these people, all being descended from them, are all essentially kind of related in a way. So, slavery was actually not all that common, I'm thinking, among the Israelites, because the only people they could have as slaves would have been outsiders, essentially. So anyway, okay, let's move on to verse 47 and then kind of wrap this up. Suppose a foreigner or temporary resident becomes rich while living among you. If any of your fellow Israelites fall into poverty and are forced to sell themselves to such a foreigner or to a member of his family, they still retain the right to be bought back, even after they have been purchased. They may be bought back by a brother, an uncle, or a cousin. In fact, anyone from the extended family may buy them back. They may also redeem themselves if they have prospered. They will negotiate the price of their freedom with the person who bought them. The price will be based on the number of years from the time they were sold until the next year of Jubilee, whatever it would cost to hire a worker for that period of time. If many years still remain until the Jubilee, they will repay the proper portion of what they received when they sold themselves. If only a few years remain until the Jubilee, they will repay a small amount for their redemption. The foreigner must treat them as workers hired on a yearly basis. You must not allow a foreigner to treat any of your fellow Israelites harshly. If any Israelites have not been bought back by the time the year of Jubilee arrives, they and their children must be set free at that time. For the people of Israel belong to me. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So this still doesn't really say anything about the Jubilee, allowing for the freedom of outsiders who were bought as slaves during the Jubilee kind of process thing. But any Israelites who wound up being sold to a foreigner would then go back in the Jubilee year. And the theme that I'm picking up on with all this is that, whether it's with the land or with the people, you're not really even, the idea isn't that you are purchasing the person or the land or anything like that. You're essentially purchasing the time, whether the time with the land or the time with the person. So, while they might have technically kind of had slaves, from the outsiders, they still, the attitude of it wasn't like, okay, I own you, you are just property, you're nothing. It was more so, all right, it was almost more of a hiring out, essentially. So, there wasn't supposed to be an air of, disrespect or being better than the person in question. While you might financially be in a better situation, the idea was they're there living with you and helping you do your work in a lot of cases, sure. But that's really what you're getting out of it. You're getting the work that they're doing, not like ownership per se of the person. I mean, that might be a little bit debatable, depending on how you define the terminology and look into the semantics of it. But again, the intent more so was, okay, you're getting, you're getting a certain time with the land that you can, get production out of it. You can get crops to then sell off or what have you. Same idea with the people. If, they were being purchased, you were getting the work from them to help you, harvest your crops or whatever might have happened that could have helped the owner earn money. So, anyway, I think that's all I really have to say, especially regarding, differences there and how, their slavery, even though it was still called slavery, was kind of a bit different than what we typically think of as slavery, and probably, the people around them and how they did slavery as well. And I just realized I missed a footnote at 25:9. Okay, so that said, on the 10th day of the 7th month. Okay, so that was just specifying that, the Hebrew mentioned the specific day on the calendar rather than just talking about the particular occasion in reference to the Jubilee year. Because that was already laid out in a previous chapter at what time of year that was supposed to be. But anyway, okay, so I think that's all I've got for Leviticus 25. Okay, so basically, little snippet regarding basically a land Sabbath, where they were supposed to, not plant new crops every 7th year. And then another event after so many years, this time the year of Jubilee, which was basically supposed to be every 50 years. And a whole bunch of stuff happened then. Details obviously in the chapter. But basically a lot of things returning to their original status, essentially. People in particular. But anyway, yeah. Suppose that does it for this one. So, as always, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description to get info on other social media pages and stuff like that. And leave comments below with any thoughts you have. So that's all for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next video. But until then, stay cool, people.